Coleman couldn't help but wonder just why in the hell he joined the army as he sat in his foxhole, eating a processed cookie. How many days had it been since they landed on this hellhole? When was the last time he slept? What fucking time was it? He wanted to look at his datapad to check the time and messages, but he had to maintain light discipline. It was pitch black at night, and he knew there were lizards a little over 100 meters away from his position. Coleman looked over to his left to see a mangled Kong corpse that managed to make it to their lines. They were getting desperate and throwing everything they had at them. Join the army, they said. Go to exotic places, they said. Meet interesting aliens, they said. And eat some delicious alien cuisine. All of those things happened, but in the worst way possible. He was on a shithole planet killing shithead aliens and eating shit food. To make things worse, the company was supposed to be relieved and they were to fall back to the staging area. However, the funny thing about being decisively engaged meant that any time anyone moved an inch, the entire front would light up like a fucking Christmas tree. They were in very deep shit. All of a sudden, Coleman heard some rustling just outside of his fighting hole and immediately grabbed his weapon. "Eagle!" someone yelled in a hushed tone. Soon after, a figure with several maws and a pack full of ammunition rolled into his fighting hole. Coleman was always impressed at how Elijah seemed to still be able to function, and he couldn't imagine being a medic in this situation. Just thinking about it was absolutely exhausting. "I got maws, ammo, food, and baby wipes," Elijah said, dumping the contents of a rucksack onto the floor. He then took off his assault pack and started rifling around until he found what he was looking for. Bags and loperamine. "Here, take this, and don't shit in your hole," he said before stealthily pulling himself out of the foxhole to make more deliveries. As Elijah navigated the blown-out line that Alpha Company was dug into, he couldn't help but feel himself nearly fall asleep on his feet. He was really fucking tired, but he had shit to do. "Eagle!" he yelled for the umpteenth time as he rolled into his last stop. The soldier just across from him lowered their weapon and started to crawl towards him. Elijah just started emptying the contents of his salt pack and rucksack he brought with him. "Hey, Kuribayashi, I got you ammo, maws, food, and 40 mil... He started listing his delivery before he was cut off by the figure grabbing him and pulling him closer. Eli's eyes went wide when he felt a pair of hungry lips cover his own, and arms wrapping around his body. The attack seemingly ended as fast as it started, the moment he felt the kiss end and a hand pushing him away with force. "There's more if you make it out of here alive," Kuribayashi said while grabbing the supplies Elijah dumped on the ground. Elijah sat there, wide-eyed, unable to comprehend what just happened. Okay," he stammered out, scrambling to his knees. Just before he climbed out of the foxhole, he looked back at Kuribayashi, who giggled and gave him a sly smile. "I guess I gotta make it out of here alive, then," he thought to himself the moment he threw himself over the edge. A task that he admitted was harder than it sounded, but with the newly arrived reinforcements, it was no longer impossible. As Elijah was making his way back to the platoon commander, the damned whistle of incoming fire whirled just over his head, causing him to immediately hit the deck. "Incoming!" a voice yelled out of the darkness. Vroom! The night turned to day as repeated explosions rocked the entire perimeter, and Elijah could do nothing but lay there and hope nothing landed on him. For a full 5 minutes he laid there, covering his head with his hands, trying to be as flat as humanly possible. "I lied. Maybe I won't make it out of here alive," he said in his own head while explosions crept closer to his position, and the hiss of superheated shrapnel whizzed over him. As the barrage started to die down, he found himself nearly buried in upturned earth and debris. "Eli, are you still alive?" Kuribayashi called out, with a hint of worry in her voice. Spinning over on his back to get all the dirt off himself, Elijah started the process of self-assessment as he patted himself down to make sure he wasn't leaking or had a hole anywhere. "Yeah, I think I pissed myself, though," he yelled back. The moment he said that, the entire line turned to hell, as a hail of incoming and outgoing gunfire poured from every foxhole and tree line. "Good! Get the fuck in here!" Kuribayashi yelled while she popped a 40mm grenade into the darkness. "Ah, shit. Here we go again," Elijah muttered to himself as he got up and hurled himself into the foxhole. It seemed this was going to be another long night of human waves. Well, lizard waves, slamming into their position. Another hiss resounded overhead as more rounds of indirect fire screamed overhead, but instead of hitting their position, it slammed into the Kong tree line. It seemed that the artillery crews were on point and dialed since the counterfire didn't relent. "It would be nice if we could do a counter-battery," Elijah said in his own head, while he patted down Kuribayashi to make sure there weren't holes in her as well. It wasn't possible, however. Due to Kong electronic warfare, they couldn't differentiate what was real incoming rounds and what was just spoofing. They were just going to have to make do with what they had and hope that the counter-barrage was enough to blunt their attacks. Unfortunately, it wasn't. Legions of untrained Kong conscripts slammed all along the human positions on all fronts. It seemed the Kong had planned on not allowing them a single hour of peace, but the Helljumpers of Alpha Company had already accepted their fate. They were dead, and they were already in hell. Now the only thing left to do was establish their beachhead and overrun the Devil's position. And on that note, Elijah and Kuribayashi brought their weapons over the top of the foxhole and opened fire. It had been a week since Lyria had received a reply from Coleman, and her anxiety had hit an all-time high as her thoughts went wild. Why isn't he responding to me? Was he upset with me? Did I do something wrong? I definitely did something wrong. There was only one reason why he wouldn't reply to me. I touched him, so he must be upset. There was no other possible explanation. Emperor, save me. Why am I such a fuck-up? Every minute that passed, she would check her datapad to make sure there wasn't a notification, and she would sometimes open the DM and reread all of those messages she had sent throughout the week. She cringed so hard that tears started forming at the corner of her eyes as she read the messages she sent to Coleman over again. Hey, how are you doing? Are you busy today? I was hoping we could have another study session. You must be busy. I'll DM you later, okay? If you need help with whatever you're doing, just let me know. You must be swamped. I'll give you some space. Are you okay? It's been a few days. Why aren't you responding? Are you mad at me? Did I do something wrong? I'm sorry. I'll never touch you like that again. I'm scared. Why aren't you replying? Why are you ignoring me? I'm sorry. Please respond. Lyria couldn't help but think how disgustingly desperate and needy the messages she sent sounded, but she wasn't able to help herself. Even now she wanted to send another DM. Giving out a whimper of heartache and embarrassment, Lyria buried her head into her arms on top of the table she was sitting on. She couldn't help but silently weep at the fact she was being ghosted, and she had no one to blame but herself. Fuck it! I'll just be single forever! She half yelled into her arms. I'll just be a priestess and devote myself to the Emperor! The surrounding Tari raised an eyebrow at Lyria's little outburst, and decided they needed to give that particular table a wide berth. Unbeknownst to her, a pair of Tari escorting wheelchair-bound Uvil were out of earshot, staring right at her as they waited in line for their food. Isn't that the second lieutenant? Liliandra asked in bewilderment. They were a ways away, but she could make out the second lieutenant was sitting at the table next to the beginning of the line. Elitaria's eye couldn't help but twitch in annoyance at the sight of that woman. Ignore her, Lully. Elitaria couldn't help but have a small bit of contempt leak from her voice. She isn't even worth looking at. Liliandra awkwardly looked at her and knitted her eyebrows. Tori, aren't you being too harsh? She's as green as they come, and she did her best with what she had. Liliandra countered. Caught off guard by the pushback, Elitaria's eyes went wide from the surprise retort, and then went narrow as she focused in on the insolent private. Excuse me? You're there too! She made the wrong call! She nearly yelled. Yeah, in hindsight. You know our training. Liliandra shot back. Klaxis just sat there, unsure what to do in the situation. His eyes just stiffly looked left to right, and all the Tari starting to edge away from them as well. I need my legs back, he thought to himself, while the two women bickered behind him. You're holding her to a standard that isn't only unfair, but impossible to meet, Liliandra yelled in defiance. Klaxis flattened his ears and narrowed his eyes once the octaves went up a level. He at least wished they would move up with the cue. He was hungry. Excuse me, can you please move? A random voice called out behind them, but was immediately cut off by Elitaria's unbridled rage.
"What? Go around and shut up!"
she bellowed and immediately returned arguing with Liliandra. Klaxis just calmly closed his eyes the moment he saw the horde of people behind them, awkwardly walk between the screaming match and the mental breakdown at the table. You know what? Fuck lunch. Just fucking kill me. Klaxis opened his eyes for a moment, only to be greeted by the sight of an unending stream of anxious soldiers walking around them as they stared at the spectacle. However, his daydream of his mortal coil ending was ruptured by the blaring alarm of the emergency intercom. Every head anxiously looked up towards the speaker as it squawked 3 times to get everyone's attention. "Attention! All medical personnel must report to the aid station," the voice over the intercom yelled with authority. "This is not a drill. All medical personnel must report to the aid station." A second after the announcement, an uncountable number of Tauri and Uvil personnel immediately stood up and sprinted out of the cafeteria. Klaxis snarled at the message. His position in the human command structure gave him access to real-time reports of what was actually happening. He could see the confusion and anxiety spread across the rest of the soldiers' faces in the cafeteria, as they murmured and speculated about what could have possibly happened. However, the most important thing he noticed was the line. It was almost empty. Coupled with the fact the 2 stopped bickering behind him, it was a joyous occasion.
"Quick! Before the line gets longer!"
Klaxis pointed forward with his good arm, in hopes to spur them into action and distract them from their previous arguments.
Yes, sir."
Caught off guard, Elitaria pushed the wheelchair forward to progress further into the queue. Klaxis pumped his fist inward in celebration, when the 2 quit their bickering and felt the gentle push forward as they progressed in the queue. Ever since those damnable humans pumped him full of those tiny machines, his hunger had been ravenous. It was as if he was constantly starving. He easily ate 5 times the amount he would normally eat during a regular serving. However, you could see how his recovery was making incredible progress. The humans' method of healing was ingenious. They combined their nanites with the Imperial's tailored stem cell treatment to make their tiny machines literally rebuild his body. Klaxis still pondered the legality of it since nanotechnology had been banned in every corner of Imperial space. But that was a thought for tomorrow, for they were next in line. What a joyous occasion! A joy that lasted for only a few short minutes, before it was destroyed by Liliandra's curiosity and lack of tone control. "Does this have anything to do with that human battalion being cut off and surrounded?" she asked loudly with her finger on her chin. This caught the attention of nearly every soul in the cafeteria, as several heads immediately honed in on the 3. Klaxis' smile just slowly deteriorated as he sat there staring at Liliandra. When he looked around, he saw every pair of eyes glued to them, and each mouth whispering into another's ear in gossip. Lifting up his only good hand, Klaxis slowly brought it to his face to cover his eyes, in order to massage the building pressure behind his eyes. What Liliandra blabbered out wasn't classified per se, but it still wasn't something that should be just blurted out in public, especially with so many curious and gossiping Tauri in attendance. Elitaria couldn't believe it. One of her privates nonchalantly committed such a brazen breach of OPSEC right in front of her. Her hand seemed to move instinctually as they reached out, wrapped around Liliandra's neck, and squeezed.
"You!"
she bellowed in anger. Angered beyond reason, Elitaria impulsively grabbed Liliandra by the neck and proceeded to drag her away from the line. Klaxis let loose a long and defeated sigh. It seemed that the very divine was working against him. Now he sat at the head of the line, with servers awkwardly staring at him, and a horde behind him unsure if they should cut in front of an officer. Oh, how he wished his hollow and vapid life would have just ended in that godforsaken jungle.
Excuse me?"
A voice sounded just to the right of him.
"Just go around, please."
Klaxis groaned, still rubbing his eyes. Instead of the sounds of footsteps overtaking him, Klaxis just heard what seemed like anxious shuffling.
I'm sorry. I just had a question."
The voice called out again while stuttering. Moving the hand from his face and opening his eyes, Klaxis was greeted by the most curious sight. There stood Second Lieutenant Lyria Evki, twiddling her thumbs and anxiously squirming as she stared at the floor.
"Please?"
Lyria asked while sweating bullets. She would never have had the nerve to speak to the First Lieutenant, but her desperation to find information on Coleman pushed her over the edge, after hearing they might have information on the humans. Klaxis did the best to look over his shoulder and saw Elitaria dragging her victim out of the cafeteria for what he assumed was an apocalyptic smoking session. He was alone. But when he looked back over at the nervous woman, he saw an opportunity. I have conditions, and I make no guarantee to answer your question, Klaxis said carefully while evaluating her. Lyria looked up in surprise. She fully expected a scathing dismissal at best, but now she was at a loss what to do while her mouth flapped and her legs shook. Klaxis waited for a few moments for Lyria's reply while she stood there nervously like a deer in headlights. I take that as consent, he said while pointing at the waiting lunch lady. Take me there.
Yes, sir.
She almost violently snapped out of her reverie and jogged around to push the wheelchair. Divine be damned, nothing will stop me from my meal, Klaxis said in his own head.